War. President Eisenhower warned us in 1962 in his farewell speech about the military-industrial complex taking over. What he didn't say was that it had happened before World War I, a long time before. That they had created 2 world wars and many other smaller ones in their greed. Eisenhower's election stopped them. He didn't want any more wars. But he was really no better, as he was just from the military group of the demon, as was JFK, whose assassination was really a coup. It was the military-industrial complex taken over from the military side of the demon. It was really just a conflict between thieves. Both JFK and Eisenhower, both cowards. So many lies, hundreds of millions dead, for money. If they are not stopped now, all is lost for mankind, and the future for our children is only continued wars. It is time for truth to slay the dragon. Greetings. My name is Mike Little. I'm here to present Whore, the Rape of the United States by the United States government. Democracy was invented over 2,000 years ago. It worked because they didn't have bankers. Fascism is a government that controls big business. Oligarchy is when a small number of people control government. Our executive leaders in business, government, and the military are full of men and women who wouldn't know duty, honor, and patriotism if it bit them on the ass. Some honorable, patriotic men and women get into Congress. They just don't get into leadership positions. If they did, our country would be a lot better off. 6 January 2021 was no accident. The rioters had a green light to do what they did. While rioters stormed the halls of Congress, the FBI, Homeland Security, National Guard, Pentagon, Secret Service all stood by, refusing multiple requests from besieged Capitol Police for help. Every one of the people in these organizations are sworn to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. They did not do so. They violated their oaths. They should be charged and fired. The people that were behind this incident will try again. They tried before. At the height of the Depression in '32, thousands of out-of-work World War I veterans camped out in D.C. wanting to cash out their 20-year bonds issued in 1924 for their service in World War I. Retired Marine General Smedley Butler sympathized with the protesters. He had dinner with them and stayed with them the night. The next day, President Hoover ordered General MacArthur to break up the demonstration. Major Patton did so. The next year, a group of aristocrats tried to engineer what is called the business plot. The plotters wanted to arm 500,000 veterans, stage a coup, and make General Hugh Johnson, an FDR administration official, dictator. They asked retired Marine Major General Smedley Butler to lead the rebellion. He refused. I believe he deserved a 3rd Medal of Honor for this decision. 2-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner, retired Major General Butler, testified before a secret committee in Congress on the matter and who found that a coup had been planned. But the plotters had so many connections that their names were redacted from the final congressional report and no action taken. The aristocrats included J.P. Morgan and Prescott Bush. Prescott was going to be the ambassador to Nazi Germany. The press joked about the whole thing, calling it a hoax. Smedley was not done. He wrote War is a Racket, in which he claimed that in his 32 years of military service he had basically been a muscle man for Wall Street. In Honduras and Dominican Republic for sugar companies, Honduras for fruit companies, China and Mexico for oil companies, Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba for National City Bank. He joked that he could give Al Capone some hints, that the best Capone could do was operate his racket in 3 districts of Chicago, that he himself operated on 3 continents. Bottom line for the business plot, the plot in 33 was real, but the people so well connected and had so much money that absolutely nothing was done. The demon had created fascist regimes in Italy and Germany, plus a communist regime in Russia. They wanted to do the same thing here. Prescott Bush would further glorify himself by colluding with Nazi companies in World War II, one making the gas used to kill Jews. After the war, they tried to take him to court, but instead both his son and grandson would become presidents. Different people, but the same group responsible for the plot in 1933 is responsible for what happened on 6 January 2021. They are still in the driver's seat. They need to go now. 2021 was not the first time someone called for help and no one came. Back on 7 December 1941, the USS Arizona blew up right around 8 o'clock. Right around the same time, the USS Oklahoma took 4 hits on the bayward side under the waterline. It was said that they were torpedoes. I have my doubts. FDR and Churchill wanted war. They wanted as big a disaster as humanly possible. I think the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the HMS Prince of Wales were all sabotaged. The USS Oklahoma was hit by numerous torpedoes, or sabotaged in the first 2 minutes of the attack on Pearl Harbor. These hits were all under the waterline, on the side facing the bay. She would take on so much water on that side that she rolled over in 8 minutes, capsized. My father was on the ship right next to it, inboard to it towards the pier. There were so many battleships in that day that they had to put them up 2 abreast down the pier. It was the USS Maryland. It was stuck for a year. His presence at Pearl Harbor that day is the reason I was researching the attack. The USS Oklahoma. Ships' names are capitalized in proper usage. 440 sailors were trapped in that ship when it rolled over. They lived for weeks in the cold and the wet and the dark. One man managed to swim free. They beat continually on the hull with dogging wrenches and anything else they could find. You could have heard them for miles. The beating got weaker and weaker and finally stopped around Christmas 1941. No one came to their aid. No one drilled holes in the bottom to give them new air. The bottom was not armored. FDR knew this. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, he had supervised their construction. I've seen a picture of him standing on the hull of the USS Oklahoma while it was under construction. They built the hull upside down, and they flipped it over and built the rest of it. Our Navy and FDR let them poor sailors of the USS Oklahoma die for pure propaganda value, to fan the flames of war in the hearts of Americans. It worked. It was only for profit. It was a worldwide effort. They were performing social engineering around the world. By the time you conclude my presentation, you may agree. I hope so. It's time we go for peace instead of war. I wrote a book about it in 2020, then thought about why they did it. I wondered if shady things were still going on. So I asked them. Placed a video on YouTube in November about my 2020 book. Then I sent a registered letter to the Chief of Naval Operations to his Chief of Staff on 10 December 2021. 2 weeks later, they started intimidating me with a NCIS surveillance team and drones. The whole story in itself. I just told them to shoot me if that's what they wanted, just using an American bullet. Bunch of spy Boy Scouts. It all started August 1941, the Atlantic Charter meeting. FDR and Churchill had a meeting on the HMS Prince of Wales, the POW. It would be sunk on 10 December 1941. All the military brass came. It was a crisis meeting as Russia was being invaded by Nazis. 2 million man army. The two discussed Europe and Asia. In addition to tactics, responses, and logistics, they talked about ship schedules worldwide. Officially, the meeting was to declare that all men had the right to govern themselves. 2 weeks later, Russia and Britain invaded Iran. The Brits kept it until 1971 when they gave it over to the Americans. We know how that went. Lord William Sempill. This was a man that was on Churchill's staff. He worked in the Air Ministry in London there. 20 years ago, the Brits accidentally released a file on him from 1941. I call him Lord Bill. He has quite a name, much longer than I'm typing out. Turns out MI5 was monitoring the Japanese embassy's radio traffic. They were decoding it and overheard them transmitting the notes home from the Atlantic Charter meeting in August 41. They asked Churchill about it, and he says, yes, those are the notes. These notes included the port schedule for the Pacific Fleet, the United States Navy. They thought Lord Bill did it. He was probably Ian Fleming's inspiration for James Bond. Ian was also working for Churchill. He was his spy master. Lord Bill was a spy from 1920 to 1941. Just not sure who he worked against or who he really worked for. The smoking gun. The picture shows Yamamoto and Sempill. This is in Tokyo in 1921. Lord Bill's got a weird uniform on because he's on a mission. He had been sent by the royal government in 1921 to Japan to help them build their first aircraft carrier. See, Sempill was a pilot. In World War I, he first started flying with the Royal Army. And then when the Navy started their air squadrons, Lord Bill went over and he ended up as a squadron commander at the end of the war, and him and all his friends were retired. He was a colonel. And when the Japanese started building their first Japanese aircraft carrier, they requested help from Britain, and they sent 10 official requests to England. And none of them were responded to except for the last one, in which time they sent Lord Bill and a dozen others to Japan to help them build their first aircraft carrier. Ever since I was a kid, I've been studying World War II and the war in the Pacific. In middle school, I read a history book that showed a picture of Yamamoto's dead body sitting in an aircraft seat that had been ripped out of an aircraft in a crash. It was next to a big tree with smiling Americans standing about. But his body showed no trauma. Even at 12 years old, I thought that was strange. In 2020, I wrote 80 Sin, a book about Yamamoto and the attack on Pearl Harbor and the collusion between FDR and Churchill. I sympathized with Yamamoto. I thought he'd got the wrong end of the stick. Today, I think he was still alive, that he was as big a traitor to the Japanese people as FDR was to us. Fake deaths. In 1945, Yamamoto's boy would be killed at Atsugi Naval Air Station in Tokyo, a place I worked at for several months in the 90s as an aviation weather forecaster for the United States Navy. The son got his head chopped off by a propeller, but today I think they both lived a long life. Yamamoto wanted to lead his sailors only when they were winning, and staged his own death, and I don't know where he went. Maybe Abe in Japan in 2022 staged his death, and maybe the Queen too. When you have millions, you can fake anything. Today, they have a copy of my new book and are running. They are cowards. For the 50th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Public Affairs Office on Hickam, right next to Pearl Harbor, they wrote a book. They put it together from all the official records that they still had on hand in 1971. And it's available in book form from Amazon, and it's also available for download from the DoD. Turns out the island had a full-scale military alert exercise for a solid week, where every gun and foxhole was manned right before the attack. The exercise ended that Saturday. The ammunition was locked up and everybody went home. The attack was the next morning. It's why MASH units were still fully deployed at Pearl. The book also details that General Ball's headquarters had tested a new British-style command and control system for air defense in early November that year, a month before. It integrated their 7 new radar sites, along with the Marine and Army air squadrons on the island, with a central command and control center. A mock attack by a carrier 100 miles out to sea was detected 85 miles out and intercepted by our fighters 30 miles out. This system was not implemented and was completely inactive on December 7, 1941. In fact, the 7 radars were ordered by General Ball to be turned off at 6 a.m. as sneak attacks only happen at night. At one site, the 2 privates waiting for the bus to take them to breakfast. The bus was late. They were playing with the radar. They saw the attack coming. They called the headquarters, told them about it. They told them don't worry about it. America in crisis. My name is Mike Little. Mickey, Mr. Little, call me as you will. I'm a retired Navy weather forecaster. Also did a lot of oceanography. 20 years. Then spent another 20 as a corporate computer engineer. My clients were SAIC, Navy, EDS, Marathon, and BHP. I had a secret clearance for almost 30 years. I'm a military historian. The war in the Pacific is my specialty. I write books, not very well. Try to get better. In my studies, I have found issues everyone should know about. The crooked government and bad banks. What a lousy combination. They have been covering up secrets that the public has a right to know. They are good at it. It is often only the blank spots that tell us something went on. For instance, 9/11. The fall of the two towers started an almost 20-year war in the Middle East. But instead of attacking Saudi Arabia, who financed the operation, we attacked Afghanistan and Iraq. The government files on 9/11 are still locked up. Will never be released. We spent hundreds of billions fighting there, thousands dead. Oligarchy. This is what we have in the United States and any country with which the U.S. has a mutual defense agreement. Too many to list. Philippines is one of them. Plus our adversaries, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, and North Korea. The same group controls all of them, the U.S. and Britain. They control the money. They have us by the balls. A small number of extremely rich individuals in control of banks, the Bank of London, Amsterdam, Sweden, Hamburg, and the 6 banks composing the Fed, which is a corporation by the way, and multinational corporations are in complete control of the leadership of Congress and the presidency. It has been that way since President Grant won the election of 1868. They have done the same pretty much across most of the world since 1945. I call them a demon, one very much like Medusa, with many heads, and they all turn you to stone. The people that work for them I call agents. Money. In 1776, our opponent was already well ahead of us. He knew very well how to gain and keep control of a constitutional government like the U.S. You take control of the money. Their very constitution was drafted in a way to enable them to seize control and keep it. It has always been about power and money. Create a strong federal government and take control of the money. First send in the intellectuals, then lawyers, then the real demons, the bankers. To pay the bills of the revolution, they created the first bank of the United States with a 20-year limited charter along with a slew of other agencies, IRS, Customs, Treasury. Then a second bank in the United States when that was done. Then when President Jackson refused to renew the charter in 1836, another bank was created in the very same building, National City Bank. This would later become one of the 6 banks comprising the Federal Reserve System. They make our money. The weak link in any government is the money. Take control of that and people relinquish their control to the bankers. This is what happened. The Fed is in league with the demon. He may very well be the demon. After the revolution, we were a country with 13 states who had a cumulative bill of 30 million. That's about 1.45 billion today. The Army itself had not been paid what was owed by the states and were given markers it promised to pay. Speculators financed by the Brits bought up these markers at 10 cents to $1. After the federal government was created, some in Congress wanted to give payment in full to the original holders of the markers, to the American soldiers of the Revolution. This was not done. Instead, the speculator bankers that bought them for 1/10 of their face value were the ones that got paid. The soldiers that had fought for our independence were left holding the bag. We had just paid back the British for their cost of the war. Early in 2022, Jill Biden flew to the Ukraine and met with the president of that country. Why would the president's wife fly into a country at war, where missiles were hitting such targets as schools and malls? Sounds dangerous, and I would not have allowed my wife to do a similar antic into a war zone. They had to know she would be safe. Must be more to that trip. I expect that at least in the cities that targeting coordinates for the missiles used against the Ukraine were not generated by the Russians. They were generated by the British and Americans, probably at CIA headquarters in Langley. It is a nest of traitors at the highest levels. They work for bankers, oil companies, and aristocrats. A game of risk, world domination. Not for conquest. They already owned it. Rather for profit, continually playing the Cold War and various adversaries against each other. Everybody continually needing the newest weapon systems. Fearful citizens around the world gladly paying for it. The bankers make more money. From 1936 to 39, Spain was in a civil war. The demon agent Franco against everybody else. The Italians and Nazis helped. Afterwards, he stayed in power till the 70s. He said he could not have succeeded without American help, especially Texaco and Ford trucks. They were getting the world ready for World War II, killing, rapes, concentration camps, showing off the world's appetite for such things, also showing off their new weapon systems. Kind of like Ukraine today. Earlier in the year, the Russian flagship Moscow was sunk in the Black Sea by a Ukrainian cruise missile. She had 396 crewmen on board and suffered 1 killed. This is a picture prior to the ship going down. She has a 15-degree list to port. She appears to have controlled the fires since the smoke is only black. Only a portion of the smoke is black. And I don't see any boats nor people in the water. Doesn't appear as anybody's getting off this thing. Like their army, the Russian crew was likely mostly conscripts, sailors with little training or experience, and poorly equipped. The lack of lots of black smoke indicate fires are nearly out. The list shows a lack of basic damage control. Counter flooding would have controlled leaning. A cruise missile would have hit above the waterline, showed more damage. Water from fire parties could have caused flooding in the list of port. Would expect a lack of damage control knowledge to do that, but would expect more damage to that side. I would also expect lifeboats to be in the water, along with sailors. This looks like a civilian-created fake. The HMS Prince of Wales, 10 December 1941. This ship was struck multiple times by aircraft torpedoes. This is what a sinking of a military ship looks like. Controlled chaos. Lifeboats and the crew getting off the sinking ship. They don't want to go down with her. They are fanatics and must be in control. They likely killed these presidents, Lincoln, Garfield, who wanted to go back to the gold standard. JFK was one of them, but rebelled. Same with FDR, who thought he was powerful enough to resist them. Like Medusa, the demon has many heads that work independently from each other. while in secret following a grand master plan directed by their bosses in Washington, D.C., Amsterdam, and London. Sounds crazy. I thought so. But history and the screwed up world we live in support my theory. They revealed themselves to me in December 2021, but covertly, and used national security to cover it up, attempting to intimidate me into silence. I told them to F off. Only by studying history can we avoid the mistakes of the past. I will examine some figures in history that I believe have carried out the work of the demon. They may seem like disjointed events, but bear with me. I will start with Secretary of State John Watson Foster, 1893, followed by Sun Yat-sen, who is the father of both Communist and the Republic of China. John Watson Foster. He was the focal point of a lot of bad stuff. He was an agent for the demon. His actions and those of his descendants would directly lead to the Spanish-American War, the Russian-Japanese War, 1905, World War I, the Russian Revolution, World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam, the death of JFK, along with many other millions of innocent deaths. He was not a nice guy. John Watson Foster was a lifetime agent for the bankers. America's first spy chief. A lawyer in the Civil War, John had been a colonel with the 25th Indiana Volunteer Mounted Cavalry and fought against Confederate guerrillas who had strong civilian support. The rebels would attack on fast horses and afterwards just melt away. Only by using spies, bounties, and ruthlessness were they able to overcome them. He was the grandfather of longtime CIA Director Alan Dulles and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. His daughter would marry Secretary of State Robert Lansing. The three would help engineer the downfall of the Tsar of Russia. The clues. Both Northern and Southern officers in the Civil War specialized in intelligence. It was the only way they could keep track of the enemy. In contested states like Tennessee, where mounted guerrilla raiders operated, it was critically important. John became very skilled in spycraft. It helped save the lives of his soldiers. John would take these nefarious skills into civilian life and hone them to perfection in continued service to the United States and the bankers. In the war, one of his fellow agents, also a colonel, a lawyer by trade with the 70th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, was Benjamin Harrison, who would go on to be the 23rd President of the United States, 1889 to 1893. His father was also a signer of the Constitution. Sun Yat-sen was born near Macau in 1866. When he was 10 years old, he moved to Hawaii and lived with his brother in Honolulu, where he went to high school. He was sent back to China in 1883. He continued his studies in Hong Kong, where he was baptized in 1888. Under the Christian missionary Dr. John Kerr, he earned a medical degree in 1892. The same year, Hawaii was annexed and Sun was given U.S. citizenship. He also started planning revolution against the Emperor of China. Finance from foreign sources, including Sun's brother. His group kicked off the first uprising in 1895. It failed, and 70 group members were captured. He went to London while his brother and family hid in Maui. A wanted man in China, he was kidnapped by the Chinese consulate and nearly sent back to China. This was in London. After 12 days, he was released after the British government intervened and newspapers publicized his plight. Afterwards, Sun traveled via Canada to Yokohama, Japan in '97, where he became friends with Mariano Ponce. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. My apologies. He was a demon agent Filipino planning his own revolution in the Philippines. Also a demon agent. Sun hoped to have a staging area in Luzon for his next Chinese revolution. I believe that would have been Subic Bay. Sun would send 10,000 rifles and 6 million rounds of ammunition to the Philippines in support of the revolution. The ship carrying these weapons supposedly sunk in a typhoon near Taiwan in July '98. As they lacked an officer corps, the retired Japanese officers were also sent to the Philippines to serve in the Filipino Revolutionary Army. The Philippines have been in the demon's pocket since '98. The dictator Marcos was an agent, as is his son, who has just been elected president. Another friend of Sun's was Charlie Soong. He was born in Shanghai in 1861, moved to Boston at 17, and joined the forerunner of the Coast Guard, the U.S. Revenue Marine. After 2 years, he moved to Wilmington, North Carolina, where he converted to Christianity and began training to become a Methodist missionary, befriended by Julian Carr, who owned Bull Durham Tobacco Company. With his help, he then went to Duke and Vanderbilt universities, where he studied the Bible and received a degree in theology. In 1886, Charlie went back to Shanghai as a missionary and founded the Commercial Press. It is now the oldest printing house in China, and joined a movement to overthrow the emperor. 1894, he met Sun at a church in Shanghai. Charlie would be his behind-the-scenes support. He would provide funding and material support for him. They finally succeeded in overthrowing the emperor in October 1911. The Republic of China was started the next year. Charlie married Wei Sing and had 5 children. Full house, 3 girls and 2 boys, all educated in the States. The 3 girls attended West Leland. In '88, Ah Ling was born. She married H. Kung, who was the 75th descendant of Confucius and the richest man in China. He was a Christian and received a bachelor's degree in theology at Oberlin University in Ohio and Yale, where he got a master's in economics. He served as Ministry of Industry and Finance from 27 to 44 and was the premier of China at the start of World War II in 1939 and the vice premier of China from 39 to 45. Qingling married Sun Yat-sen, and after Mao died, was acting president of the Republic of China from 1968 to 78, and was the honorary chairman of the Communist China in '81. The third daughter, Mi Ling, would marry Chiang Kai-shek, president of the Republic of China in Taiwan. One son, TV, was the chairman of the Central Bank of China and Minister of Foreign Affairs. He lived in the West throughout World War II and was supported by FDR. He negotiated with Stalin on the fate of Mongolia and Russian bases in China. TV created and was the money behind the Flying Tigers. Their leader, General Chennault, was paid by the Bank of China. He would command the Chinese Air Force in World War II. TV would finally move to New York and died at a chicken party hosted by the Bank of Canton in San Francisco from a chicken bone. The second son, Zi is scrubbed off the internet. The little information available shows he was a banker in Hong Kong. In my investigation of the demon, I found that he uses two main methods to bend history. It's part of his modus operandi. He uses these over and over again. One is omitting key facts and over-reporting the rest. In naval terminology, we call this baffling you with BS. JFK's assassination is of this type. The second main method is erasing all evidence. And they use this one a lot. That also included murder. When the person was doing something really bad, he is erased. All Zi-Win's siblings were presidents and heads of central banks. I suspect he headed the demon's secret police or managed the heroin business. But that is pure conjecture. Whatever it was, he was important. After examining the history of John Watson Foster and son, I have determined that General Simon Bolivar was probably a demon agent. He looks to be a South American military version of Sun, raised in Colombia. He was sent to France for education, where he met his wife. Financed by the Brits, who furnished soldiers and likely ships in his conquest of Spanish colonies in South America. And he is revered across South America, just like Sun is revered across China and Taiwan. After oil was discovered in Mexico in 1869, President Grant selected John Foster to become America's first spy master. Grant sent him to Mexico in 1973 to be the first U.S. minister to Mexico, where he remained till early 1880. From there he went to Russia until mid-81 as U.S. minister under Hayes and Garfield. Then to Spain, as U.S. minister 83 to 85 under Presidents Arthur and Cleveland. In all those places, John Foster laid the groundwork for the bankers' long-range plans of corporate takeovers, revolution, and war. In Mexico, it would take a generation to create a revolution in 1910. They would end up in control of the central bank and the country's oil. The demon waited until 1900 to start his work because they had been waiting for the Civil War veterans to retire. They would not approve of what had followed. During John Foster's first years as minister in Mexico, he set up government-supported subversive organizations that focused on advancing the goals of the bankers, both political and business. They got in on the ground floor of oil in Mexico. It's still the third largest oil producer in the Americas. Makes one wonder why most Mexicans are dirt poor. They were keen on allowing the bankers in. Bribery is part of their culture across the Catholic world, while the Russians were much more reluctant and would suffer 3 wars on their land in the next 60 years. The bankers don't like a lot of people. Russians, blacks, Jews, Arabs, poor, or people like me, trans. Everywhere Foster went, he set up newspapers. These were propaganda machines that promoted views and policies the bankers wanted. In his official position, he would push governments to allow these same newspapers to print what they wanted, freedom of the press, if it's in the best interest of the demon. This would occur across Russia, North and South America, plus Mexico, Central America. Others would set them up in Japan, China, and Korea. And to this day in the U.S., they pretty much control the Mass media. Just look at CNN and Fox. The pogrom. In Russia, these papers created hate and distrust of the Jews. It resulted in rioting across cities, across the land where thousands of Jewish people were literally dragged out of their homes and killed. It's called the pogrom. In Germany, it's the Holocaust. This worked so well that they would continue this crusade against the Jews in Nazi Germany, and millions more would die. After World War II, the Jews realized who was responsible for the millions of deaths and blackmailed the bankers, the English and the U.S., with this information into giving them their own land. It would be called Israel. America continues giving them over $1 billion a year in blackmail money to this day. In Russia, Foster created newspapers and networks that would give material support to the fledgling revolutionaries of the era, while encouraging the Tsar to let publishers and newspapers publish dissenting views such as communism. Vladimir Lenin's older brother was hung along with 5 others when Lenin was young, after he was caught trying to assassinate the Tsar with a bomb. After that disaster, they shifted plans to the righted generation. John Foster's grandchildren, Alan and Foster Dulles, and Robert Lansing, his son-in-law, would make the Russian Revolution happen. According to Mullins in the World Order, Lenin's wife was related to the Rothschilds. This brought Lenin into the bankers' immediate fold. No idea where they met, but it was not a marriage of love, as after he served his purpose, she likely poisoned him with heavy metals, another favored tactic, probably used against FDR, 45. Foster was not done. He married and had 2 daughters. Edith would give birth to Alan Dulles and Foster Dulles, 2 of the most influential people in the 21st century. And Eleanor would marry Robert Lansing, who was Secretary of State during World War I. All 3 of these men would work together, shaping history over the next 100 years, and not in a good way. They gave America to the bankers to do with as they please. They made us the bankers' whore. President Wilson ran on a platform of keeping America out of World War I. He was always going to join it. American business was always heavily involved in both world wars, selling everything from steel and oil to our enemies and mosquito netting to the army in France when there was no mosquitoes. Our aristocrats opened limited liability corporations in Switzerland in 1914, where they and the Swiss built weapons of war and sold them to both sides. Completely illegal. They just had to be sold in components and parts to the combatants. Swiss workers demonstrated about the morality of it and the low pay. That's why we didn't enter the war till 1917, to prolong the war as long as possible and let our companies make more money selling weapons. Bankers had a field day, along with the undertakers. Our companies sold fuel to the U-boats in neutral ports, the same boats that were sinking our ships. In the next war, George Bush's father, Prescott Bush, would assist Nazi corporations. He was a financial expert. One was making the deadly gas used in the gas chambers. After the war, they tried to try him for colluding with the enemy, but he was never taken to court. Instead, both his son and grandson would be presidents and start wars in the Middle East to further enhance the demon's wallet. The Swiss supplied electricity to both sides in World War I and II, along with providing safe passage to the Nazis at the end of World War II. They had denied safe passage to Jews seeking to escape the Nazis and the impending Iron Curtain after the war. While she was touring the war-torn areas in Eastern Europe, some seeking to escape the communists appealed to Eleanor Roosevelt in person and were denied help. A coup happened in 1963. In January of that year, JFK fired the head of the CIA, Alan Dulles. In November '63, he was killed in Dallas. It looks like ex-director of the CIA, Alan Dulles, who had been director of the CIA since 1950, and the rogue CIA, and Vice President LBJ staged a coup by assassination. Then they covered it up. Every president since then has covered it up. By President Johnson's order, there was only one official investigation in the assassination of JFK. Alan Dulles was on the investigation board and was in charge of selecting what information to be presented to the board. I think he may have been the one who fired the kill shot that took the top of JFK's head off. It's always been about money. In 1861, after the Civil War started, Lincoln went to New York for financing the war and was quoted rates at 25 to 35%. So he created the greenback in 1861. It's called that because the backside used green ink. This was a demand note not backed by gold, nor by debt debt in the form of bonds held by banks. $50 million were issued by Congress. The greenbacks were restricted to custom payments and debts to the government. They were not legal tender. In '62, Congress first issued legal tender in greenback form, $450 million, not backed by gold. Lincoln joked that on the reverse side to print, "Silver and gold I have none, but such as I have I give to thee." The use of money not backed by banks scared the demon. This was an idea that could ruin them. They used their influence in Congress to pass the National Bank Act in 1863. The remainder of the war would be paid for using money that was backed by bonds held by banks, as we do today. This was also the period when the Tsar incurred the demon's wrath. Around 1863, he refused to let the demons create a similar bank in Russia. It spelled the doom of a 1,000-year reign by the Romanovs. After the war was over, Lincoln was re-elected. He then wanted to repeal the National Bank Act and go back to the greenbacks. 41 days later, he was dead. Garfield was not a fan of the banks controlling the money. He issued the statement that whoever controls the volume of money supply in any country is in absolute control of all industry and commerce. Weeks later, he was assassinated. From 1860 to after 1970, the demon was absolutely ruthless. Lots of victims. Presidents Lincoln, Garfield, FDR, and Kennedy. Generals Smedley Butler, Simon Bolivar Buckner, and Patton. Admiral Borda in the late 80s shot himself in the heart at his home, the backyard of his home, and near the Naval Observatory in D.C. Secretary of the Navy John Forrestal in 1949. The Navy inquiry into Forrestal's death said he was dead and they had nothing to do with it. In spite of his being taken screaming from a guarded, fully staffed VIP hospital floor in Bethesda, taken to the top floor of the admin building next door and tossed off with his robe belt tied around his neck. I figure it was J. Edgar Hoover himself who tossed him off that ledge. He is the only one who could have gotten past armed naval guards on the floor below without a fight. At the highest levels, our federal executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government have been infiltrated by traitors. They are thieves and cowards. They fear me. Jointly I call them a demon, as they are evil. The traitors in the system I call agents. They stayed on me until I complained 5 weeks later to the state police, attorney general, and the governor. They had answered my question. The people responsible for the death of those sailors are still in power. Thought about why they had done it for another 8 months. Read a lot of history. Investigating FDR, Alan Dulles, Foster Dulles, Bill Donovan, etc. There's a whole bunch of them. Then I started writing. We had a coup, not an assassination in 1963. History's kind of skewed in that way. JFK's death was not an assassination. It was simply a power shakeup in a gang of thieves. A coup that had succeeded in plain sight. Demon bankers and makers of weapons of death wanted war. The military demon agent, General Eisenhower, had relinquished power to the rising military star demon agent, JFK. The demon agent, Lyndon Baines Johnson, became president after JFK was shot. Our nation's oilmen now own the throne again. They still have it. They pinned the blame on Oswald and called it an assassination. The CIA link, Alan Dulles. JFK had promised Alan Dulles that he would destroy the CIA and spread it to the four winds, then fired him from his position as director of the CIA, a position he had held since 1950. He did not take it well. 11 months, Alan Dulles was probably the one that fired the shot that took JFK's head off. He was probably on the bridge ahead of the car. That's why the top of JFK's head landed on the trunk, where his wife Jackie climbed to and picked it up on the way to the hospital. Alan was in charge of deciding what evidence to show at the investigation, the only one ever done, by LBJ's orders. Afterwards, his agent brother Robert was angry, wanted to take it back. They didn't want him to have it, so they killed him in '68. It was really a dispute among thieves. JFK lost. So would his dad, brother, and son. But thieves have no place to go for justice. FDR was a demon business agent, as was Truman, working mainly for the aristocrats in business, oil. But then the military demon agents took over for the next few presidencies. But they lost it in '63 to the oilmen when they had JFK assassinated. And they kept it until Nixon. And then after Nixon, it's been a mix. Oil business. All agents, I think. It's a crime against humanity. At least 20 to 30 generations of them have tormented us 500 to 600 years. All evil men desired money and power above all other things. They want control. They have it. I call them a demon, for that's what they are. Most all the wars that have ravaged the planet since 1400 are the work of these evil men. Their descendants are still in power, all over the planet. Presidents, CEOs, actors. We inherit the fears of our fathers, mothers. Studies have shown that people who have experienced PTSD have low cortisol levels. These levels are associated with fast pulse, increased alertness, fear, and paranoia, and faster reaction times. This gets passed down onto their children and grandchildren, but not after that. Only then do the levels drop. The bottom line is trauma affects us, our children, and their children. It makes perfect sense in a premoral world where fears of the parents get passed down biologically to their children. It's a survival mechanism of our own bodies. Like the sound of nails on a chalkboard is biologically reminiscent of the sound of claws on a rock. Our bodies have long memories. It explains how I survived over 12 near-death experiences in my life. My father had PTSD. I'm always looking for threats. When danger approaches, I'm already reacting. Our government uses mania to stay in control. Consider the amount of trauma that our government inflicts on us. Our schools, parades, and festivals have become shooting galleries for madmen. 300 mass shootings in the last year alone. A lot more than that now. It's been a while since I checked. Likewise, our cities, military, prisons, jails, and criminal justice system are full of trauma and pain. No wonder our country is jacked up. Murdoch and Ted Turner are one hand of the demon I talk about. They play a role in generating fear and trauma in the viewers of Fox and CNN. Like secondhand smoke from cigarettes can cause cancer. Hate, fear, trauma, and mania are transmitted via web pages and visual images on television. It creates mania, makes us more concerned with BS than what our traitorous leaders are doing. They know this and use it against us. On 9/11, on live TV, I watched the two towers fall and saw the doomed people jumping from its uppermost floors. I was both enraged and in shock for months. Same with Christmas Day 2004 when I received the automated email from the USGS Earthquake Service telling me a 9.2 had just occurred in Sumatra. I knew in that instant that many thousands were either already dead or soon going to die. Trump mania is real. Half of America accepting lies as the truth. Thank God it's now mostly a bad dream. The last 2 years of the Trump presidency, I had to turn off the TV and turn the remote over to my sick Okinawan wife. I had become overloaded and realized it. Watched the Japanese channel for the remainder of my wife's life. Didn't even watch the election. After she died of cancer, I canceled my cable subscription. They are priming us for another civil war. Non-stop disasters and fighting between CNN and Fox fueled the Trump mania fire. They made Trump by their constant coverage of his antics. They set America on fire, fueling hatred across the board, all sides constantly throwing fuel to the fire. Using issues such as abortion, religion, race, and sexual identity, they drive wedges between America. Their networks constantly cover these. Asians, blacks, gays, and now trans are favorite hot button items when they're not using fear of terrorists or communists to drive us to war. And these two channels are not the only ones they own. They own all the major news services. They own them. We have a sick government. Our federal political system is dysfunctional. They are unable to govern. The only things Congress can agree on is bankrupting this country by excessive spending, selecting equally dysfunctional Supreme Court justices, and passing any legislation that favors business over the people of this country. My dog Lucy could do a better job. Other than that, they are constantly fighting over abortion, trans, gay rights, gun rights, extending the investigation of Trump and his insurrection attempt, plus a lot of other dumb stuff. Anything other than cutting the budget. The demon supports candidates who create the most havoc. It is why Trump was elected. It fuels the manias of Americans. I think the cable owners, president, and heads of Congress are all working for the demon. Some may be stupid and crooked as hell. Either way, they must go away. By the way, Trump is a master at psychological warfare. He is the best con artist I have seen since the 70s. Not that he isn't an idiot, but he has my respect. If you're gonna be something, be the best. He also had the demon's backing. Hell, Daffy Duck could be president if the demon wanted it. How to slay the demon. Love is the key, and voting every incumbent out of office is the answer. Don't let dark thoughts, fears, and hatreds make you who you do not want to be. When the train of bad thoughts start running, simply stop and think about the people and things in your life that you love. Do this every time the train leaves the station. Every time. If you must do it every hour for a minute, do it. Give yourself a break. Stop the train. It gets easier with practice. You can love life again. This is the secret Jesus taught. He didn't walk on water. He taught them how to love. The writers of the Bible and leaders of the church twisted the words because they never felt true love and didn't understand. The people in the parable felt like they were walking on water. This is how true love feels. That you are walking on air and every breath of air hurts. Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha, and many others through the ages have taught the secret of love to their followers. But this message was twisted in later years by those who seek to control and gain power over you. It is all about central control. The churches use their edited version of Jesus to con you into believing you must go to church to be saved. They get to keep the donations, many of which are going to the demon. They are extreme about it. For example, 100 years ago in the town I lived in Texas, they hung a man because he didn't believe in God. Central control. A strong church creates central control of the masses, a religious version of the federal government. Control the center and the masses and their donations and taxes in the federal government case are yours to do with as you please. Communism is even more profitable. Then you own the businesses and keep the profit. It is why communist and Catholic countries are mostly poor. They have been leeched by the demon's communist and church agents. It is very likely that in 1776 that the British let us win the American Revolution. In comparison today, it would be like Venezuela winning a war against the United States. No, King George and the bankers had a much different plan for us. They knew us better than we knew ourselves. They did some return on investment calculations on various scenarios and found it would be far cheaper to let us win and just buy our politicians. They just had to create the groundwork and wait till John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. Our biggest monuments likely honor traitors. In 1776, when Mayer was 33, King George was trying to subdue the American Revolution. He asked the bankers for help, and they sent Mayer from Hesse, Germany. Mayer Bauer, who later changed his name to Rothschild, was glad to oblige. He immediately offered his own army to King George. This is the 16,800 Hessians who fought for the British in the Revolution. It looks as if General Benedict Arnold was set up. He was the reason we won the Battle of Bunker Hill. This was when the Brits were trying to split the colonies in half and was a pivotal battle in the War of the Revolution. The war would have been finished right there, but General Arnold was a fighter and disobeyed a direct order to stand down, returned to the battlefield, and won the battle. The Hessians on the critical end of the left flank of the Brits were cooking lunch, and that's where they went around. It was the turning point of the revolution. In return, he was chastised by Congress and eventually hung for treason on trumped-up charges. Their first flag, Grand Flag of the United States, 1775 to 1776, when we adopted the Stars and Stripes. This is the East India Company flag, 1800. Pretty darn identical. What was our founding fathers trying to say in 1775? I feel pity for them, men with no soul, such twisted lives full of lying and deceit, living in fear of detection, fear of the masses. Many will have fake deaths. It's part of their modus operandi. We're seeing it today in the news. They run and hide. Not sure where they go. Maybe New Zealand. Origin of a demon. They started as bankers, merchants, and makers of weapons and ships in Florence and Venice. In Venice, they used modular construction techniques to build galleons, one a day. Galileo was helping them, the guy that built the telescope to see the rings of Saturn. It was a shipbuilding factory using canals, the same canals that our tourists today marvel at in Venice. The bankers managed the Pope's money. This was the seed money for the whole ungodly operation. Oh yeah, the Pope is filthy rich. He is still deep in it. After the New World was discovered in 1492, Northern Europe began to flourish with trade. The demons began their northward move, first up into Switzerland, and Austria, excuse me. They moved north. The bankers moved to Amsterdam in 1609, opening the Bank of Amsterdam, and likely joined forces with the descendants of the Vikings. Then they opened the Bank of Hamburg in 1619 and the Bank of Sweden in 1661. Then it got interesting. 1609, the demons started the Bank of Amsterdam. 1619, Hamburg. 1661, Sweden. The northward push had begun. The Hudson Bay and East India Companies. These were probably the most profitable companies of all time. Greater than 60% annual dividends for hundreds of years. 1670 was the inclusion of the Hudson Bay area, Hudson Bay Company, another company that paid huge dividends for hundreds of years. Company was just sold around 2000 for $1 billion. They backed King William III in his coup against King James II in 1688, who let him create the Bank of England in 1694. They decided to conquer the world. By 1730, in addition to the opium and the spices they got from India, they took over Madagascar, and they shipped a lot of slaves from Madagascar. They were heavily into the slave trade. They were busy making money, at least the way they did, caused a lot of victims. In their conquest, they killed a lot of people and just let a lot of others just suffer suffer from starvation. England, 700,000. Bay of Bengal, up to 10 million. India, 500,000. Ireland, another million. India again, 4.5, 5 million. Persia, Iran, they lost over half the population. South Africa, 50,000, mostly women and children. This is where the Brits invented the concentration camp during the Boer War. The men that they captured were shipped overseas while their women and children were put in concentration camps where they starved to death. 1700s, spices and food from India and Bengal. Even though the locals needed the food, they shipped it to England or other places in their empire and sold it. And they, once again, a lot of slaves from Madagascar, shipped them all over their empire. The main changes we see by 1788 was the inclusion of New Zealand and Australia. So they had a huge trade across all those areas. A lot of money coming to England. 1800s, the East India Company had a 250,000-man army, along with fleets of armed merchant vessels. They used this force to subjugate hundreds of millions. In those countries, they were God. They shipped millions of pounds of opium from India to China and the world every year. Tobacco, sugar, cocaine, gold, silver, copper, and most importantly, saltpeter for gunpowder came from the Americas. Silk and fine china from Asia. Slaves and later gold and diamonds from Africa. Then came railroads, oil, electricity, and the Industrial Revolution. And all along the way, they were making weapons of war and fostering conquest around the world. By 1801, we're seeing huge changes. We're seeing the inclusion of Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, India, Madagascar, and then new places in Africa, Egypt, all the way south, just north of South Africa, and portions of West Africa. They plundered resources across this entire region. And this was also the period of time that they took Ireland. Revolutions. When the downtrodden rebelled, they found it was far cheaper to just let them go. But they would use bribes in their newspapers to get their own agents elected. This let them have their cake and eat it too, just like they did in the US in 1776. But it wasn't enough. They wanted the whole earth. To quicken the pace, they engineered world wars and revolutions. 1817. This was also the period when General Simon Bolivar arranged for the conquest of Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador. He was financed by the Brits. Realms like Russia and China were problems. They did not let them in. They would attack both of these issues at the same time, from the east and the west. They used their superior guns to subdue the Emperor of China and forced open the door of China to vast imports of opium. Foreigners would split the country in 8 parts, effectively taking it over. Churches were free to buy land and build churches. In Japan, the emperor was a figurehead. The samurai had near total control of the country. So the demon gladly helped out and gave him gold, ships, and guns to fix it. From like 1860 to 1900, they gave him dozens of ships, steel ships with good guns. The Emperor of Japan had climbed into bed with the demon. In 1868, the Boxer War started, and within 2 years, the samurai were outlawed. Then they helped him start the Japanese Empire by selling him, giving him dozens of steel ships. They started their expansion with Okinawa, then Korea and Taiwan. The American Navy helped. And the Japanese Empire was financed in large part by opium sales. Whenever they took over an area, they would go in and kill all the local opium dealers and open up their own shops. On this slide, we can see the inclusion of China over to the east. And it's not red yet because the emperor is technically in charge of China, but the British had guns and cannons that shot far longer than the primitive cannons and rifles that the Chinese used. They were using more of a musket while the British were using rifles. And they were shooting out 600 yards. And their cannons, I have no idea how far, but they were shooting further than the Chinese cannons. So they didn't have much trouble defeating any Chinese forces that they came across. So the Emperor of China had to concede to any demands that the British placed on them. And this was a time of after the oil had been discovered, actually not discovered, but how to refine it, how to make kerosene. And kerosene was the new light of the night. Previously, sperm whales had been used to light the lanterns of the rich. But when kerosene was invented, the process to refine it, the oil rush was on. And that's when the oil boom started. And to really implement their oil boom, they had to go over here, right in this area. That's where they had saltpeter deposits up in the desert, high deserts of the Andes. And these deposits were, there was enough of it that they could commercially mine it. And they used this to make gunpowder, a very high quality gunpowder. And this was shipped over to Japan and around their entire empire. And it gave them very high quality firepower when other people were having to use leaching methods to get saltpeter out of cesspools. It was quite a achievement. Exploding battleships. Big money does not go away. It moves to new investments, bigger deals. That's what they did. Slaves went to tobacco, to drugs, to oil, diamonds, and gold. But that was all small change. They wanted control of the world's money supply. To get there, they went through the Spanish Empire. And to destroy the Spanish Empire, they would sabotage the USS Maine in 1898, starting the Spanish-American War. In 1900, there was new atrocities across the world. We took the Philippines and Cuba, and the British took South Africa, the gold and diamond fields. This was around the Boer War. They killed 50,000 in that area. We killed another 50,000 on Samar Island alone in the Philippines. The general in charge said, "Kill everybody above 10 years old." Mark Twain was outraged and wrote extensively against the whole operation. But we would stay in the Philippines until the Japanese took it from us in 1941, and then we finally conceded and let them form their own country in 1945. In the West, Cuba, we took that over also. Got all the tobacco and sugarcane fields. It did take quite a not as big a battle as they did in the Philippines. Spanish didn't fight nearly as hard as the Filipinos. Revolutions take a long time, a lot of planning. Lenin, Trotsky, Sun Yat-sen, and Charlie Soong spent years in Japan, Switzerland, America, and England, preparing, planning. We used gold, priests, missionaries, newspapers, and lies. The U.S. would be integral in the infiltration and destruction of the Chinese and Russian imperial dynasties. The creme de la creme for the demon was Russia and China. And you'd think from history that, these things were kind of spontaneous and, they happened overnight. And, the Chinese just got upset and, started the Chinese Revolution. Same in Russia, Trotsky and Lenin just went back there and, hey, they kicked up enough fuss that, within a few months they overthrew the Tsar of Russia. But no, these things took over a generation to engineer by the demon. Sun, Song, Trotsky, Lenin's brother, they all played a part. And they happened, 30, 40 years before. And it was an accumulation of all their efforts that enabled the demon to overthrow these realms that had lasted 1,000 years. The demon came in, money, gold, religion, missionaries, churches, newspapers, politicians, and America played a big role in the fall of both of them, encouraging their regimes to accept newspapers and accept what they printed, even if they printed things that they really didn't want to see. Yes, we were there. Our ships, our men, thousands of volunteers went to China from America, and I would expect a corresponding amount went to Russia, fostering discontent, financing discontent, and in the end, dragging the Tsar's family, him and the Tsar's family out, killing them in the middle of the night and burying them. Yes. Then they stole his money. Tsar had $15 billion in U.S. banks. That would be today's money. Almost $1 billion back then. And he had a lesser amount in England. And what did the banks do with that money? They kept it. I would expect a lot of that went into the banks that compose the Fed today. It's a scar on America's honor that will never go away. God bless America. But God damn the things we've done. Desert sands. The demand for oil exploded when vehicles began to be mass produced. A few years later, in 1932, the Americans found oil in Saudi Arabia. the American Oil Company was born, Aramco. Now, in addition to making money, they begin literally pumping it out of the ground. The British were already strong in this area, in this period. Lawrence of Arabia made movies on him, very famous. But the inclusion of Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all the places with oil there, they were all sucked into the demon's fold just quick as can be, where they remain. It's one of the reasons that the Middle East did not experience major battles during the World War II. Some areas did, mostly in North Africa, but the Middle East itself, that was sheltered, remains sheltered to this day. Although they've had wars, these wars have done little to interrupt the flow of oil, which is what the demon holds most dear, at least at this point, other than information. Besides the Middle East, Central America and Spain were the last to go before World War II. At the demon's direction, General Butler would help American corporations take over Central America and the Caribbean. Franco in Spain would test both weapons and the world's appetite for war and social change. They both proved to be insatiable. World War II and after. Like World War I, World War II brought massive change and destruction across Europe and Asia. But at the end, it brought in all the little countries of Europe and Asia and created a safe haven for Nazis in South America. They used it as a social bulldozer to make all those little countries that were just too much trouble for the demon to do one by one. He just did them all at one time. Destroy them. The bankers came in afterwards with loans for rebuilding. Central banks were created wholesale. The Cold War and arms race started and continued to this day. All the related manufacturing kicked off major increases in CO2 and global warming. So all the problems we see today in weather, these people started it. The last picture, we only see the Horn of Africa is the last remaining place. They took it over. Can't say much else. The demon won. Control via infiltration and war. Vanity is their biggest weakness. Their footsteps are all over history and film. They first corrupted the Catholic Church. The Netflix series Medici is likely a recreation of their takeover of the Pope over 500 years ago. It's all about control and profits. It's why the Pope is against birth control. It would cut into his ever-growing base and decrease future donations. They were likely behind the Protestant-Catholic split in the 1500s. This led to centuries of war. See, war is even more profitable than the church. Plus it creates a villain. A method they use to keep people distracted and them in control. If you want to sell them weapons, make them afraid, you have to have a villain. It's why Cuba, Taiwan, China, Russia, Iran exist to justify a $770 billion defense budget for the United States. It was all a new business model. At the height of their power in 1900, the British Empire had over 400 million people under their direct control, and likely twice that many indirectly. The churches which they corrupted long ago control several times that many. But the native people were getting restless. See the rebellions in India in the 1850s onward. The modern rifle and pistol that used cartridges in the hands of rebels made these firestorms far more costly. They could no longer just come in and kill the people fighting for their freedom, so they transformed their empire. They let them create their own governments, but took over the central banks in those countries. Then used bribery and their newspapers, and they own most of them, to have their own candidates elected, just like they had done in the United States starting in 1776. Money, power, and control. They invented central banks. These managed the money of nations. In antiquity, they used gold and silver to make coins that were the currency of countries. This was bulky and heavy. Then used paper money backed by gold in reserve banks, the gold standard. Then they scrapped all that. The banks invented a new way. Money not backed by gold, it would be backed by loans from demon banks, the central banks. Central banks started issuing government bonds that backed money. These accrue interest at a determined period set by the central banks. The Fed does this in the U.S. They would loan big banks money at the federal rate. Big banks, their friends, loan that money to customers at the prime rate, home loans, etc. This gives them control of the economy. A low rate invigorates the economy, creates booms. Big investors move away from government bonds. Stocks go up, loans are cheap, inflation occurs. A high rate causes recessions. Investors seek shelter and migrate towards government bonds. Stocks go down, loans cost more, deflation occurs. It seems that one group who have no scruples at all are in control of all the major central banks: US, England, Canada, Australia, EU, China, Russia. This gives them God power over the economies of the world. They create booms and busts and tell their friends when they are going to happen. They make billions while everyone else loses. To create these banks, they devise revolutions and world wars. Favoritism. Congress is on its knees in front of anyone with money. We see this in our world today. The top slots in our government organizations have become revolving doors between them and business. In addition to every other evil thing he did, John Watson Foster was the first lobbyist in the U.S. Companies are allowed to draft the very rules they operate under, giving them freedom to do whatever they want. Oil, energy, mining, media, healthcare, drug companies, banks, manufacturing, food, all doing whatever they want with no consequences. It's just an unending onslaught on the people of America and the world. These are demons from the very pit of hell. Discord. They use their own nationalism, pride, greed, and emotions such as love and hate against ourselves to distract us from the real enemy, our government, building vast hordes of power and wealth. They are politicians and aristocrats. They have embedded themselves in the very fabric of our government and that of the G7. Using mass media on CNN and Fox, they channel their emotions in whatever direction they want us to go. They desire power and money. To get it, they engineered all the major wars of the 20th century and previous. It's easy when you own all the major news organizations and key politicians worldwide. We are like mad dogs. Beat the drums of war and Americans will come. Media creates divisions. They don't stop with wars. They demonize groups. Japanese in the 20s, 30s. Nazis and communists in the 40s and 80s. Blacks and gays all the time. Now it's gays and abortion. Congress and Murdoch, along with the president, colluded to create the 2021 coup attempt. They thrive on war and own all the major weapon manufacturers and news organizations around the world. Using Fox and CNN, they have polarized the U.S. so badly that we are ready to disintegrate and fight among ourselves. This is their plan, to break up the U.S. and feast on the remains of our dear democracy. Back on 6 January 2021, I expect if the coup had succeeded, that afterwards Trump would have suffered an accident and Pence would have taken over. The demon is a religious militant after all. We would have become the Baptist equivalent of Iran or Saudi Arabia. Let me begin with the facts. Pearl Harbor, 7 December 1941. My father was on the USS Maryland that day. My glorious father was still drunk from a Saturday, playing baseball with the Arizona crew, followed by a long night of drinking. At 8:05, after the Arizona had blown itself out of the water 500 yards away, he was hanging out a porthole screaming, "What's going on?" It did not go well for him, or any of us. Let me begin with some facts. Pearl Harbor, 7 December. First to die early that day was the crew of the SS Cynthia Olsen. It went down about 1,000 miles due west of LA. It's a civilian freighter chartered in October by the Army and was hauling lumber to Pearl to build barracks. There are a lot of issues with this sinking on December 7th by Commander Yokota of I-29, a Japanese submarine. It was the first flag to me that something is very wrong today. Many more flags would follow. In late November 1941, a Japanese fleet of 4 carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, light cruisers, 11 destroyers, 9 oilers, and 35 submarines headed east in the northern Pacific. The fleet was commanded by an Admiral Nagumo and was supposed to be in its training area in the northern Sea of Japan, the SOJ. Instead, this 35-vessel fleet crossed into the northern Pacific and transited to a location about 1,400 miles north-northwest of Oahu. They mod-locked about 1,200 miles south of Adak, just about the worst place in the world for weather in the northern hemisphere. This was no pleasure cruise. Weather was not good and the seas were at best 12 to 24 feet most of the time. These ships normally use radio to talk with one another. During this period when the fleet transited across the Pacific, they used a deception radio ship to simulate traffic from the fleet, and the ship was located in the Sea of Japan, would make it look like they were still at home. It is the official position of the U.S. government that the attacking fleet maintained radio silence. In a twist of fate, during the same period, the SS Lurline was transiting the Pacific, going from Asia to the west coast. They were about 1,500 miles due south of the Japanese fleet, approximately. They were headed from Asia to Honolulu and on to San Francisco. Ship radio officer was Navy Reserve radioman Leslie Grogan. His hobby was listening to whatever radio traffic he could find, and in a transit on the vast Pacific, he had little else to do. During the late 70s, as a weatherman on the USS Constellation, I would do the same thing at night. Pick up a teletype signal and feed it to my teletypewriter, just to see who was talking. I used it to print out weather data to plot maps. Also got news, sports, even death to the Americans propaganda from Red China, if we were close enough. This is a map of the North Pacific. You can see the track of the attacking Japanese fleet as they came from their Sea of Japan training area up through the straits into a position approximately midpoint between Pearl Harbor and Adak. And these big red circles indicate about 1,000 miles. In addition to the attacking Japanese fleet, you also had the SS Cynthia Olsen. She came from the Vancouver area and transited to a point right where the star is at, where she was sunk. In addition, we have two other ships. We have the Canadian ship HCMS Prince Robert and American SS Lurline. You can see how the tracks kind of coincide, and then you can see where the Japanese fleet, they transited down in approximately this area and launched their attack on Pearl Harbor. And there was other ships out there. We had the Enterprise group. They was right about here. They were just under 200 miles out, sitting there at waiting for the attack to happen. And they were just far enough that it would take their aircraft a long time to help. Too far away to actually make a difference. Leslie Grogan, when he was transiting across, they pulled into Pearl. When before he pulled in, he noticed these same Japanese Navy call signs were originating from two different areas. One of these sources died during the day, the other didn't. This was due to the daily disruption of the ionosphere by the sun. It screws up long-range VHF radio signals during the day. Ranges go down 1,500 miles. That he could still receive the signals told him the Jap fleet was that close to him. For instance, you can receive AM radio from extended ranges at night. These die off when the sun comes up. Very high frequency radio does the same. FM radio is not affected by this effect. It is line of sight. Prior to arriving at Honolulu, Leslie Grogan tracked that fleet across the Pacific to a point midway between Adak and Pearl. Then it stopped moving. After the SS Lurline arrived on 3 December, he went to the headquarters of General Ball in Honolulu and showed him his maps and logbook. Told him a Japanese fleet was sitting 1,200 miles northwest of Oahu, that they were using deception to seem like they were still in the Sea of Japan when they wasn't. He was ignored. On arrival in San Francisco, his ship was boarded by armed Navy sailors and his charts and logbook confiscated. Elephant cages. The government has these big radio detection stations all over the world. Big arrays of antennas arranged in a circle. Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines during World War II, December 1941. They look like elephant cages for really big elephants. They have state-of-the-art gear and receiving radio signals, all kinds of signals. Spy stuff. A lot of spies sitting in there. These are 1,000 times bigger and sensitive than the gear Leslie Grogan used. Do you really expect me to believe they heard nothing? Really? Back to Cynthia Olson. They had been sailing back and forth from the west coast to Hawaii for many years with an experienced crew of 33 Americans. The Army chartered their last voyage in early October. Prior to departure, they were inspected by the Coast Guard and had to get 2 new lifeboats. Oddly, they got no emergency rations or water to go with them. The attack. Official Japanese naval records that I accessed online stated that the I-29 attacked them with a torpedo, but the ship refused to sink. They were then allowed to board their lifeboats, and the ship was sunk by the sub's deck guns. Before they left, Commander Yokota recorded in his log that the crew had no food or water. They had time to send an SOS stating their location and were being attacked by a submarine. Leslie Grogan was underway again and received this SOS on the SS Lurline. Oddly, he was the only person to receive it. That night, the HMCS Prince Robert recorded that they searched the same lat long as was received by Leslie Grogan and was transcribed on the sub's official ship's log by the Commander Yokota. They said they searched for 4 hours that night, found nothing. And by the way, wood floats, and if you ran into the debris field of that ship, you would have heard it striking the hull. The next day, another Japanese sub would return to that lat long, found them sailors, and gave them sailors food and water, as recorded in their official ship's log. These sailors were never seen again. On another historical note, when the Lurline arrived in San Francisco, they were met with an armed U.S. Navy boarding party. The boarding party went to his radio room and removed all his charts of the incident and his logs. The logs and charts were in naval records in D.C. when someone checked them out in the 70s and never checked them back in. No signature or name was provided. Issues. In a bizarre twist, in my searches I found an internet diary of a sailor on the HMCS Prince Robert for that very trip. Pictures of every day on the transit and boring daily notes for them. Posted by the sailor's son because the dad had died of cancer and he had found a diary in his stuff. And oddly, the boy died later that year, also of cancer. This is by far the most fabricated piece of evidence I've ever seen. These were analog people and not digital. They had lives. And it was 1941. Looks like the work of a green ex-gen spy. Poorly done, I must add. At this point, I think the HMCS Prince Robert sunk the SS Cynthia Olson themselves and sent that SOS. I expect the contract that Cynthia Olson signed with the Army indicated the exact route and speed they would use, and Prince Robert just waited on that route for them and probably hailed them at sea as friends, then killed them. It also looks as if the Prince Robert was carrying top secret materials from Hong Kong and Manila prior to the war starting, because they had made stops at both points right before they left. That they were a spy ship and had a A3 encryption radio device able to talk securely to DC during the night. The A3 encryption radio device was it basically fed the HF radio signals into a teletype machine, and they were able to talk back and forth using that. It's the same type of machine that the Nazis uh, used to listen in on the conversations between FDR and Churchill. After World War II, after the attack, General Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even pointed to the A3 and said that the Nazis had broken the code, and that's why he couldn't use it to warn Pearl Harbor that morning. He couldn't use the unclassified telegraph line that went between California and Hawaii because it was down for maintenance that day, oddly enough. The SS had one too. Not sure about Hitler himself, but he probably did. Heinrich Müller of the Gestapo, he was the head of it. He survived the war and talked about it in the book Gestapo Chief by Gregory Douglas. Mueller wanted a job with the CIA and was interviewed in 1948. He was a meticulous fellow, and he kept a copy of the meeting notes in his files. These were later found in the 70s. The A3 Scrambler. This was not a new device. It had been invented in the 20s by AT&T, I do believe, and it was in fairly wide use at the time, especially by those important people. And the Nazis probably picked up a copy out of the patent office. At the same time, they picked up the patents from Robert Goddard, from his patents on the liquid-fueled rocket. The NSA had a web page that verified the statements that General Marshall gave about the A3 and not wanting to use it and warn Pearl Harbor. But after my video came out in December 2021, oddly enough, the web page disappeared. The radio offices of the Naval Security Office and the White House in D.C. were probably both in direct communication with Yamamoto and the attacking fleet. They were packed with demon spawn. JFK was one of them in the office. He started working there in October 1941. Worse than cockroaches, spies multiply like crazy. FDR. Yeah, he was a demon. An agent for the demon. Heck, his own wife hated him. Especially after he had given her VD in 1928. Eleanor never lived in the same house with him after that. Even the White House. Even near the end when he was getting pretty sick and close to killing him. One side effect of VD is nerve damage. It's probably why he couldn't walk after 1931. Either that or she shot him. In August 21, I published 80 Cent on Amazon, in which I accused FDR and Churchill of collusion with the Japanese in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Even before that book was done, I was noticing that web pages in Wikipedia were being modified. Information was changing, and a page at NSA was gone altogether. This is information for events that happened 80 years ago. Bear in mind that these people have a lot to hide and a lot more to lose. They will do anything to cover their tracks and discredit me. Check the change logs of those pages. Go back to click on them. They will show you the original pages and you can see what was changed. My theory is that all the participants in World War II were in communication with each other at the executive levels. These used A3 scrambler teletypes to communicate on VHF radio waves. This would include FDR, Churchill, Yamamoto, MacArthur, Percival in Singapore, the Emperor in Tokyo, Kimmel and Ball at Pearl, plus Stalin and some of the Nazis. I don't think they trusted Hitler. Before you disregard what I claim, go see the previous versions of the web pages discussing these events and see what just changed and when. It's been 80 years and most all the participants are dead. Why the changes? In London in the 30s, they had two conferences that limited number of ships that countries could have. Japan, Britain, America, so forth. Check online for the participants of Japan's delegation. Yamamoto represented the Japanese Navy in the first London Disarmament Conference in 1930 and headed the second one in 1934. But online records have been modified, removing him, or at least those I can see on Wikipedia and other places. For hard copy, see the book Reluctant Admiral by Agawa. It details Yamamoto's participation and his heading the conference. See my books for all the issues I have found. 80 Sen by Mickey Little on Amazon. $1 on Kindle. That's as low as I could charge. Give it away if I could. Whore, The Rape of the United States by the United States Government on Amazon by Mickey Little. Again, $1. Or as low as I can charge. Haven't put them up yet. Digital copies of both may be freely distributed worldwide by individuals for non-commercial use. Ask for a copy in comments. Issues more. The deathbed confession of Mr. Smith to his daughter. He was head of emergency services for the Red Cross in 1941. Stating he had a meeting with FDR on the 1st of December, discussing it, and he told him to get ready on the West Coast for casualties. Due to her, General Ball and Admiral Kimmel would be absolved of guilt in the 1999 defense bill. The lack of response by Generals Ball and MacArthur when told of the impending attacks on the command. Ball had 4 days before, and MacArthur, he had 15 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor due to the time difference. He was not attacked until 12 noon on 7 December. Actually, it was 8 December for them. 15 hours later. The same lack of response by Stalin when warned weeks beforehand that the Nazis were massing an army at his border. Instead, he had the bearer of the warning killed and waited. No one else came forth to warn him. Colonel Hans Luck stated in his autobiography, Panzer Commander, that the Russians had 30,000 tanks. The Nazis invaded with 2,800. He said they might have had second thoughts had they known that they were facing a force 10 times their size in tanks. Again, John Forrestal, the mysterious death of Forrestal in 1949. He was under care in a guarded Navy hospital floor, a VIP floor in Bethesda. The Navy inquiry said he was dead, and the Navy had nothing to do with it. Pretty sure it was J. Edgar Hoover himself who at 1 a.m. dragged him screaming from his room to the top floor of the admin building next door and threw him off. The transfer of 400 pounds of uranium metal and oxides in 1943 from our government to the USSR. This kick-started the Cold War. Documented in the Library of Congress, April 29, 1943 is the license to do so. See World Order by Estes Mullins, and he has a whole wealth of information. The statement of Heinrich Müller, who headed the Gestapo that was monitoring FDR and Churchill's radio transmissions. He said the two discussed the impending attack on Pearl Harbor in November 1941. You can see Gestapo Chief by Gregory Douglas. Another book. The lack of retribution for the Emperor of Japan at the end of the war, along with the main planner of Japan's land war who became a politician. The lack of Pacific naval records and civilian news records for Oahu for all of 1941. The failure of the government to release documents on 9/11 and on John F. K's death. The continued increases in military spending. 10% more almost every year since 1945, except for 5 years. This is 10 times what our closest rival spends, 20 times what the Brits spend. Over $30 trillion total. The endless wars our government continues to wage, and our position as the world's police. Who put us in charge? The evidence in the congressional record that President Hoover, along with many aristocrats and other, that's evidence in many other locations, financed the Russian Revolution. Alan Dulles, the future head of the CIA, along with William Donovan, the future head of the OSS, gave $250 million in gold to Lenin a week before we entered World War I. It was all the gold they could carry, about 100 pounds each. Afterwards, Federal Reserve System banks holding the Tsar's money, that is after the revolution, they just kept the money. 15 billion in today's dollars. The creation of the Office of Information Coordination in June 1941 by FDR was headed by William Donovan, who was one of them that gave the gold to Lenin. He was given almost 15 billion in today's dollars in June 1941 to start that office. He was the last person Lenin called when he got on that train to go back and start the Russian Revolution. Donovan liked to boast about it. Another web page that's been modified. To all that's looking at this video, may God bless you. I don't care if you have a cross hanging from your neck, or you're wearing a tutu, you look funny, your color, or if you got a tattoo of Hitler's mustache 6 inches below your belly button. You are still Americans, and we need to stand firm, my folks. Let us drive forward into the future and make it better for the future than our parents left to pass to us. God bless America.